We like to think our homes are the one place where the outside world cannot touch us. We lock our doors, turn off the lights, and feel safe behind closed curtains. But sometimes the walls we build do not keep things out. Sometimes they only trap us inside with whatever is already waiting in the dark. This unsettling experience took place about 5 years ago. I had just walked away from a long-term relationship that spanned nearly 10 years, leaving me completely unmoored and navigating single life for the first time since I was 17. Like many people trying to fill a sudden silence, I turned to dating apps. That is how I crossed paths with a woman named Elise, though she insisted everyone use her nickname rather than her given name of Elizabeth. At first, things moved at a comfortable, casual pace. Neither of us was looking to rush into anything heavy or complicated. But after a few weeks of seeing each other, Elise began dropping subtle hints and eventually direct requests, asking me to stay the night at her apartment. I consistently declined. It was nothing personal against her. I simply was not ready to take that kind of step. Yet her persistence grew heavier, almost desperate, until one evening I finally asked her why she was so insistent on me sleeping over. She did not laugh it off or brush it away. Instead, she stared down at the floor for a long, uncomfortable silence before looking up and telling me that something else shared her apartment at night. I brushed it off with a chuckle, assuming it was a bad joke. She was entirely serious. For nearly a month, Elise had been waking up at the exact same hour every single night, 3:17 a.m., and every time she opened her eyes, a man was standing somewhere in her bedroom. Not right beside her, but several feet away, perfectly still, just watching. In the beginning, she convinced herself it was just a coat rack or a shadow playing tricks on her vision. But she moved the chair, and the figure reappeared elsewhere. She rearranged the furniture entirely, and it simply found a new corner to inhabit. Eventually, exhausted and terrified, she abandoned her bedroom altogether and tried sleeping on the living room couch. On her very first night on the couch, she woke up at 3:17 a.m. The figure was standing at the far end of the hallway, staring down at her. She tried to rationalize it as a severe bout of sleep paralysis, telling herself her mind was playing cruel tricks. But then she realized she could move her limbs, sit upright, turn her head, and even cry out. The entity did not react to any of it. It just stood there. One night, driven by a surge of panic, she hurled a glass of water straight at it. The glass shattered against the wall behind the apparition, liquid spraying across the surface, but the silhouette did not flinch. Instead, it slowly turned its head to face her. That was the night she stopped trying to sleep altogether. When she finally confessed all of this to me, the dark circles under her eyes and the tremor in her hands told me she was not making it up. Still, my stubborn skepticism kicked in. I suggested she was simply hallucinating from severe exhaustion. Her response froze the blood in my veins. She told me she had even tried sleeping with all the lights on. The figure did not vanish. It merely stepped farther back into the shadows. I offered a weak, nervous laugh, suggesting she needed better window curtains. But her expression did not soften. Feeling a heavy wave of guilt for dismissing her terror, I finally agreed to stay the night. We spent the evening on her couch watching television, and she drifted off to sleep before midnight. I stayed awake for a while, keeping watch, but eventually fatigue dragged me under as well. I jolted awake because Elise was frantically whispering my name. My eyes snapped open. Her face was completely drained of color. She raised a trembling hand and pointed silently toward the dark hallway. I turned and looked. At first, the corridor was pitch black. Then my eyes adjusted. Standing at the very end of the hall was a silhouette. A man, unnaturally tall, with his arms hanging stiffly at his sides, completely motionless. I stared at him for several seconds, my heart hammering against my ribs before I whispered, "Is that him?" Elise nodded, tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. I started to rise, but she grabbed my shirt with a grip fueled by pure, unfiltered terror. "Please, do not go over there," she begged. I told her I needed to see what it was. But before I could move, the figure shifted. It did not walk. Instead, its torso leaned heavily to the side, its head tilting at an impossible, sickening angle until it touched its shoulder. Elise whimpered, whispering that it had never moved like that before. Acting on pure adrenaline, I picked up a heavy couch cushion and threw it down the hallway. It launched through the air, and then it simply stopped. Not hitting a wall, not deflecting off a surface. It froze dead in midair, suspended in defiance of physics for a terrifying second, before dropping straight down to the floor with a dull thud. Elise broke down into silent, shaking sobs. The figure slowly stepped backward into the deepest shadows of the hallway, without a single sound of footsteps, and vanished into nothingness. I stood there frozen, my mind refusing to process what my eyes had just accepted as real. Despite Elise begging me to stay back, I walked toward the entrance of the hallway. The ambient temperature dropped sharply, turning the air biting cold. Then I heard it, a slow, deep, deliberate breathing coming from right on the other side of the wall. A low whisper followed. At first, the words were muffled, incomprehensible. I leaned closer, straining to listen. The whisper came again. And this time, with absolute chilling clarity, I heard it speak my own name. Panic overtook me and I stumbled backward. At that exact moment, the bedroom door in the hall slammed shut with a thunderous bang. Elise screamed in terror. I lunged forward and twisted the handle, but it was locked solid. From inside the room, a violent commotion erupted. Something heavy crashed against the wood. Then another impact, and another, as if furniture was being torn apart and hurled around with brute force. I yanked desperately at the handle, but it would not budge while Elise wept behind me. And then as suddenly as it had begun, absolute dead silence filled the apartment. I reached over and flicked the light switch on the wall. The door unlatched instantly. I pushed it open, and the sight inside made my stomach heave. The room was completely devastated. Books were strewn everywhere. The heavy desk had been flipped upside down, and a glass lamp lay shattered into 1,000 pieces. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing violently in the night breeze, and there was no screen. I stepped up to the window and peered out into the pitch-black backyard, seeing no one. But as my gaze dropped to the wooden windowsill, a wave of sickness hit me. There was a muddy handprint, facing from the inside out. Elise rushed up behind me, whispering a terrified question I ignored. Because right beneath the handprint were 5 long, deep gouges carved into the paint, as if someone had been standing trapped inside that room, desperately clawing their way out through the glass. We called the authorities, but a thorough search of the apartment turned up nothing. No footprints on the ground below, no sign of forced entry, no rational explanation for the destruction. Elise stayed with me for a few days before returning home, and the entity never showed itself to us again, at least not openly. 5 years have passed since that terrifying night. Elise and I are married now. We rarely talk about what happened, though she remains convinced it was paranormal, while I used to search desperately for a logical answer. But I have stopped arguing with her, because there is a final detail I have kept to myself, one thing I could never bring myself to tell her. The morning after that night, while she was away, I returned to her apartment alone. I wanted to look at that window one last time. The muddy handprint had faded, but etched into the paint on the wall right beside the frame was something else. A faint smear of dirt, looking like fingers dragged across the surface. 5 long streaks, and right beneath them were 3 words written in a hand that definitely had not been there the night before. You saw me. I never mentioned it to Elise. I did not want to drag her back into that nightmare, and part of me wanted to believe my own mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. And now every once in a while, usually right around 3:17 a.m., I jolt awake for no reason at all. And when I do, I refuse to look toward the hallway. Because deep down, I am terrified that one night, the man will not be standing at the end of it. He will be standing right beside my bed, watching me wake up. We like to think our homes are sanctuaries, safe havens where the outside world cannot reach us once we lock the doors and turn off the lights. But sometimes a home keeps secrets older than the walls themselves. Sometimes the ghosts in a house are not spirits, but memories of things that never truly left. This unsettling experience took place when I was 18 years old. My parents were notoriously protective, and even at that age, They only agreed to let me stay home alone for a weekend under one strict condition: my closest friend Tyler had to stay with me. There were no parties, no drinking, just two teenagers passing the time with video games and junk food. Friday night was entirely normal, right up until 11:38 p.m. The doorbell rang. Tyler and I froze, looking at each other in the sudden silence. The bell rang a second time. We checked our phones, nothing. I went upstairs, peered through the window, but the porch, the driveway, and the street were completely empty. When I came back down, Tyler urged me not to answer it, and I agreed. Then the doorbell rang a third time. This time, beneath the chime, I heard a very faint voice calling my name. I walked back to the door, ignoring Tyler's warnings, and pulled it open. The porch was completely vacant, but sitting right on the welcome mat was a small bundle of dried flowers. We closed the door, locked it tightly, and spent a restless night. By Saturday evening, we had convinced ourselves it was just some neighborhood kids playing a prank, and I had nearly forgotten all about it. Until exactly 1:06 a.m., the doorbell rang once, then again, followed by 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I looked through the window and saw an elderly woman standing on the porch. She was tiny, with stark white hair, wearing a heavy black coat despite the warm weather. And she was smiling, not a friendly smile, but the chilling look of someone who recognized you. I opened the door a few inches and asked what she needed. She looked at me and asked, "Is Thomas home?" When I told her nobody named Thomas lived there, her smile vanished. She stared deep into the house and whispered that it was strange, before asking about someone named Peter. I told her she had the wrong address, but her demeanor suddenly turned serious. "No," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I have the right house. He is still hiding." She looked straight down the hallway, adding, "He is listening." When I tried to shut her out, she stood her ground, watching the house. We turned off every light downstairs and watched her through the curtains for hours. She did not move an inch. At 2 a.m., 2:33, still there. Tyler wanted to call the police, but I kept saying we needed to wait. Maybe because we were 18 and stupid, or maybe because some part of me didn't want to admit how terrified I actually was. At 3:21 a.m., fueled by a mixture of fear and stubborn frustration, I decided to confront her. I pulled the front door open, but she was gone. A second later, Tyler screamed. I whipped around to find the woman standing at the side window, pressing her enormous, grinning face directly against the glass. As I backed away in sheer terror, she knocked 3 times and whispered, "Peter says hello." Then she dissolved into a quiet, growing laughter that turned almost hysterical before disappearing completely. Just as the police cruiser pulled onto our street, when my parents returned the next morning, the real nightmare began. The moment I mentioned the names Thomas and Peter, my mother went entirely silent, and my father asked a terrifying question. Did she say Peter? That was when I learned the dark history of our house. Years before we moved in, a man named Peter had lived there and become dangerously obsessed, with a neighbor named Thomas watching and following them until he mysteriously vanished. During that time, the previous owners discovered someone had been secretly entering through the basement window, culminating in a break-in where Peter escaped through the backyard just before the police arrived. The family sold the house out of pure trauma. But what my father said next made my blood run cold. That elderly woman was not looking for Peter for the first time. She had visited the previous owners years ago, claiming to be his mother, endlessly insisting that her son was still hiding somewhere nearby. The true dread set in a week later when my father was cleaning the basement and found an old photograph hidden behind an electrical panel. It showed the front yard of the house 32 years earlier, featuring several people, including the exact same elderly woman with the white hair and the identical smile. And on the back of the photo, someone had written a chilling message. "She knows where he is." To this day, I do not know who wrote those words, who the woman truly was, or what happened to Peter. But every few years when I visit my parents and hear the doorbell ring late at night, I never answer it. Because deep down, I know she was not trying to get inside, and she was not asking us to let her in. She was waiting for someone inside the house to answer her. And sometimes in the dark of night, I cannot help but wonder what would have happened if Peter had answered instead. When I was an 11-year-old kid, a strange boy named Lucas moved into the house right next door to ours. He was unusually quiet, someone most people at school tended to ignore because he barely spoke. But we clicked almost immediately for one bizarre reason. We were both completely obsessed with vintage professional wrestling. We could spend entire afternoons arguing about legendary matches and who the greatest athletes of all time really were. One Friday evening, Lucas invited me over to his place for a sleepover. His parents seemed nice enough, though his father gave off an intensely energetic vibe that felt a bit off. He was overly cheerful, constantly cracking jokes, showing us yellowed old wrestling magazines and telling stories about events that happened long before we were even born. But right before sending us upstairs for the night, his demeanor shifted and he laid down a hard rule: never go down into the basement. When I asked why with a nervous laugh, he just grinned and said there were things down there children had no business seeing. Lucas did not crack a smile. Sleep would not come to me that night. Around 2 a.m., soft footsteps started pacing through the hallway outside our guest room door. Peeking through half-closed eyes, I saw Lucas's father walking slowly past. He paused right in front of the basement door, glanced back toward our room as if checking to see if we were awake, and then slipped down into the darkness. A few minutes later, strange noises leaked up through the floor vents. A television humming with static, murmured voices, someone softly weeping, then a sharp, violent bang that made my blood run cold. I hid beneath the heavy blanket, praying for morning. The following morning, Lucas's father was back to his usual, overly friendly self, flipping pancakes and laughing like nothing had happened. He began talking up his massive collection of rare vintage wrestling tapes stored safely in the basement. Lucas chimed in, saying his dad owned hundreds of valuable recordings. My mind instantly flashed back to the locked door and the sounds from the night before. When I asked if the tapes were kept down there, his father smiled warmly and said most of them were. Later that morning, he left for work, leaving Lucas and me completely alone. I confronted Lucas about the noises I heard, but he looked completely baffled, insisting his father never watch wrestling late at night. Eager and foolish, I pressured him until he reluctantly agreed to let me take a peek. We tiptoed down the wooden stairs into the freezing basement, which reeked of damp earth and cold metal. Tucked away in the furthest corner was a narrow wooden door painted in a blinding, aggressive shade of yellow. Across it, someone had scrawled a crude warning in thick marker: "Do not open." Lucas whispered that his father had never once mentioned what was hidden behind it. With shaking hands, he turned a hidden key and pulled the door open. Inside was a cramped room lined with shelves packed tightly with hundreds of labeled VHS tapes. But tucked away on a lower shelf sat 5 unmarked tapes, labeled only with simple numbers from 1 to 5. Drawn by some morbid curiosity, I reached out and picked up number 3. Lucas begged me to put it down, but when I asked why, he could only say he had a bad feeling. Ignoring his warnings, I slid the tape into the VCR hooked up to a small monitor. The screen flickered with harsh static before revealing a disturbing image. It was a completely empty room painted in a dull, sickening shade of crimson, with a single wooden chair sitting dead center. There were no windows, no furniture, and no people, just the chair. Then heavy, labored breathing began to fill the room through the tiny speakers. A choked voice whispered a plea for help. Lucas grabbed my arm, begging me to turn it off, but I was frozen. The camera angle slowly drifted forward, revealing a pair of shoes lying beneath the chair. Someone was trapped on the floor. Suddenly, a second figure stepped into frame, wearing a blank, unsettling white mask. The masked person walked right up to the chair, stared straight into the lens, smiled wide, and whispered, "You are not supposed to be watching this." Panicking, Lucas yanked the power cord right out of the wall, plunging us into darkness. Before we could even catch our breath, heavy footsteps thudded across the ceiling overhead. His father was home early. We scrambled back upstairs just as the front door swung open. His father walked in, offering that same fake wide smile, but his eyes were ice cold. Without a word to us, he marched right past and headed straight down toward the basement. A few minutes later, he climbed back up, looked me dead in the eye, and calmly told me it was time to go home. There was no anger in his voice, which somehow made it 10 times more terrifying. I fled the house without looking back, and Lucas didn't say a single word. The following week, Lucas vanished from school entirely. When I rode my bike over to his house, his exhausted mother answered the door and coldly told me they had packed up and moved away instantly. Right before she shut the door in my face, Lucas peeked out from behind her, looking deathly pale. He whispered a final, chilling warning before his father shoved him away. "Don't tell anyone about the room." That was the last time I ever saw him. Years went by, and I tried to convince myself it was all just a fever dream born from a kid's overactive imagination. I searched for years, but Lucas left no trace, and the old house had been entirely demolished, replaced by a modern building with no basement at all. But then I remembered the one detail I had never shared with a single soul. When the masked man on that tape looked into the camera, he hadn't just given a warning. He had whispered something else, something I was too young to comprehend back then. He had said, "Lucas brought you," and that is when the horrifying truth truly settled in. Those tapes weren't an accident. Lucas hadn't taken me down there out of curiosity. He had been ordered to lead me straight into that room. To this day, I still wake up trapped in the exact same nightmare, standing in front of that bright yellow door while Lucas begs me not to open it. But the door is always open, and the television inside is playing that dreadful Red Room. Except now the chair's empty, the camera is pointed straight at the doorway, and I am standing right there inside the recording, watching myself. And as the masked figure turns to face the lens with a wide, horrifying grin, he whispers, "You are late." I keep telling myself it is just a nightmare born from childhood trauma. I truly hope it is. Because if that tape was real, the most terrifying part isn't what I saw when I was 11 years old. It is the chilling realization that someone recorded me watching it, and whoever made it knows exactly where I'm standing right now. Burnout has a peculiar way of driving you toward total isolation, no matter how bleak the destination might appear. At 24, I hit a wall where daily existence felt entirely suffocating. My job was stripping away my last ounce of patience. My apartment felt less like a home and more like a cage, and a string of poor decisions throughout the past year left me aching for escape. I simply needed to vanish into a place where nobody recognized my face or my history. A casual chat over lunch with a coworker planted the idea. He mentioned a forgotten island situated several miles off the mainland shore. It wasn't a commercial getaway lined with luxury resorts or crowded boardwalks. Tourists occasionally drifted over for a few hours. But according to my coworker, the entire place became a ghost town the moment evening rolled in. It sounded precisely like what I needed. After a quick search online, I managed to reserve a tiny, isolated cabin for a 3-night stretch. The rental cost was suspiciously cheap, a detail I brushed off simply because the island offered virtually zero entertainment. Without a second thought, I confirmed the booking. The afternoon ferry deposited me onto the wooden docks just before 5 p.m. Watching the other tourists scramble back onto the deck for the return journey felt surreal. Within 20 minutes, the vessel pulled away, abandoning me on the pier with only a backpack. Not just mostly isolated, utterly, completely alone. The trek to the cabin took roughly 10 minutes along a twisting gravel track. Up close, the structure was even more cramped than the online pictures indicated, featuring a single bedroom, a minuscule sitting area, a narrow kitchenette, and a bathroom so tiny I could touch opposing walls simultaneously. Thick, untamed brush crowded the rear wall, while the front windows looked straight out toward the open ocean. A thin fabric curtain covered the glass, allowing the dark shadow of the coastline to bleed through even when drawn shut. At the time, none of that bothered me at all. The initial hours were pure peace. I spent the afternoon wandering deserted trails until dusk settled, eventually locating a small diner near the harbor. The woman behind the counter seemed friendly enough until I mentioned where I was sleeping for the night. She froze mid-wipe, her rag hovering motionless over the surface. "You are staying over there?" she asked, her voice dropping. I gave a light chuckle, asking if it was a sketchy spot. She paused for a second before answering that it was merely very quiet. I told her that was precisely why I chose it. A tight, unconvincing smile touched her lips, accompanied by a quiet warning to avoid wandering about after dark. I wrote it off as harmless local superstition, thanked her, and headed back out. During the walk back, something else caught my eye. Tucked behind a cluster of trees near the rocky shoreline was a narrow cove. Moored inside was a small, weather-beaten boat painted a flat, dark green, completely distinct from the standard fishing skiffs tied up at the harbor. Nobody was around, and the water inside the cove was disturbingly still. I kept moving. By nearly 11 p.m., I reached the cabin, threw every deadbolt, and checked the latches. Everything was secure. I reached for my bedside charging cable to plug in my phone, but nothing happened. I tried a different wall outlet with the same frustrating result. The cord had apparently failed, leaving my phone sitting just under 15% battery. Under ordinary circumstances, that would have triggered mild panic. That night, wrapped in profound exhaustion, I simply didn't care. I killed the lights and drifted into a deep sleep almost instantly. Sometime after 2 a.m., I snapped wide awake. Initially, I had no clue what pulled me out of my sleep. Then the sound hit my ears. Crunch. I froze instantly, holding my breath. Crunch. Gravel shifting under heavy pressure. Someone was approaching the cabin at a deliberate, agonizingly measured pace, with long, deliberate silences between each footstep. I stared blankly into the pitch-black ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just a stray animal. Then another step landed directly outside the bedroom window. My chest seized up. For several seconds, absolute silence swallowed the room. Then another footstep sounded, shifting closer toward the front door. Then quiet returned. I waited, every muscle locked tight. Slowly, I reached across the mattress for my phone. The screen flickered awake. 11% battery. No cellular service. I attempted an emergency dial anyway, but the display instantly flashed a failure notification. That was when a narrow beam of white light sliced across the curtain over the front window. It tracked slowly from left to right before locking in place. Whoever was out there was standing inches away. The light snapped off. A second later, the front door handle rattled. Once, then a second time. The deadbolt held firm and the movement ceased. 30 seconds of suffocating quiet passed. Then a heavy blow slammed directly against the wood. I jerked backward, gasping as a second impact rattled the entire frame of the cabin. Rolling out of bed, I threw myself down behind the short knee wall beside the entrance, fully aware that flimsy drywall offered zero protection if the locks gave way. The pounding abruptly stopped. The ringing inside my ears was deafening. Then a man's voice drifted through from the other side. Daniel. My blood turned straight to ice. He spoke my name again, smooth and deliberate. Daniel, I know you are awake. I had never heard that voice in my entire life. I kept my lips sealed tight. A low, quiet chuckle echoed from the porch. The footsteps resumed, shuffling sluggishly along the side wall of the cabin, passing the bedroom and continuing toward the back. I remained pinned flat against the floor. Moments later, a sharp rap echoed against the glass. Once, twice, followed by a soft whisper right against the window frame. Daniel. Panic threatened to swallow me whole. He knew precisely where I was hiding. For the next 40 minutes, the intruder paced a slow, methodical circuit around the building. Footsteps would come and go, punctuated by another casual test of the front door handle. He never attempted to smash his way through. That realization made it infinitely more terrifying. It wasn't a desperate burglary attempt. It was a calculated display designed to ensure I understood he had total access. Eventually, the perimeter check stopped. I forced myself to wait another 20 minutes before daring to shift my weight. Then came the distinct hum of an engine down by the shoreline. A small boat motor sputtered to life in the night air. Scrambling toward the window, I eased the curtain back a fraction of an inch. A small watercraft was pulling away from the cove, its single stern light fading out into the pitch-black expanse of the ocean. Sleep never returned that night. At sunrise, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The gravel surrounding the cabin was churned up by heavy boot prints, multiple tracks weaving around the structure. But the most unsettling trail led straight down toward the water. Keeping my distance, I followed the tracks to the hidden cove. The green boat was completely gone. I packed my belongings in record time. The morning ferry was still hours away, so I barricaded myself inside, checking every lock repeatedly until the scheduled arrival time. When the boat finally pulled up to the dock, I was the first person up the ramp, refusing to look back at the cottage. Once back on the mainland, I called the rental owner to report that someone had prowled around the property overnight. His reaction was deeply unnerving. He didn't ask if I was okay, nor did he ask for a physical description. He asked only one question. "Did he say your name?" I froze before asking why. The line went silent for a moment before he told me to come down to his office immediately. When I arrived, he looked genuinely shaken. He admitted that the cabin had been broken into twice during the prior summer. Nothing was ever stolen. The doors were simply unlocked from the inside by an unknown intruder, prompting him to change all the locks. When I asked how the person could possibly know my name, he had no answers. Neither did I. I hadn't posted anything online about the trip. I had only mentioned it to a single coworker. I never gave the rental owner my full name over the phone, and the woman at the local diner certainly had no way of knowing it. Days bled into weeks while I tried to rationalize the impossible. Had someone followed me onto the ferry? Had I been watched the entire time? Nothing added up. Finally, I called the coworker who originally recommended the island and told him everything. A heavy silence hung on the line before he asked a single chilling question. Did he come from the water? I told him I didn't know. With a heavy sigh, he shared a detail he had kept to himself. The cabin had originally belonged to a local fisherman who vanished years ago. His boat never found. Local whispers claimed a small boat could occasionally be seen anchored near the island after midnight, operated by someone whose identity remained a complete mystery. When I demanded to know why he hadn't warned me, he simply said he never imagined I would actually go through with the trip. I will never set foot on that island again. But out of everything that happened, one horrifying truth refuses to leave my mind. The man outside knew my name. He knew the exact cabin I occupied. He timed his arrival after the very last ferry had departed, and when he vanished into the dark, he didn't escape by land. He left by water, which means he wasn't stranded there. He had crossed the dark ocean for one specific purpose, heading straight for me. To this day, I have no idea who he was or how he found me. And the most terrifying part is not knowing whether he was ever truly trying to break through that door, or if he just wanted me to understand that he easily could have. I have always had a strange fascination with places the world chose to leave behind. As a junior architectural researcher documenting forgotten structures along the northeastern coast, my interest wasn't in ghosts. I wanted to see how quickly nature could completely erase human history once everyone walked away. That is how I ended up on a small boat heading toward Bellwether Island. Decades ago, it was home to a classified military communications station and housing quarters for its staff. Long since decommissioned, the island sat abandoned several miles off the mainland, accessible only with special permission from a local historical society. The person taking me across was an older, weathered fisherman named Walter. Throughout the entire ride through the thick, rolling morning fog, he didn't utter a single word. When the island finally broke through the gray mist, I instantly understood his silence. A decaying stone seawall guarded the shore, hiding massive concrete structures choked by aggressive overgrowth and towering trees. It looked less like an abandoned historical site and more like a restricted graveyard. Walter tied our boat to a rusted metal piling. But before I could step onto the dock, he grabbed my arm and stopped me. 2 rules, he said, his voice flat and dead serious. Do not go into the underground buildings. And if you hear someone calling your name, do not answer. I let out a dismissive laugh, assuming he was just trying to scare me with local ghost stories. Walter didn't crack a smile. I mean it, he muttered. Without another word, he pushed off from the dock and disappeared around the curve of the seawall. For the first hour, the island felt quiet and almost peaceful. I moved through the ruins, photographing the decay. Eventually, I reached the old communications building. The main entrance was partially blocked by fallen bricks. but I managed to squeeze through a gap. Inside, my flashlight cut through the damp, heavy dark. That was when I noticed the back office looked recently disturbed. Fresh boot prints were pressed into the thick layer of dust on the floor. Heavy, deliberate prints leading straight down a dark hallway. I followed them cautiously until they stopped in front of a heavy steel door. The door itself was caked in thick orange rust, but the handle was completely clean. Someone had been touching it very recently. Then Walter's warning flashed violently in my mind. Do not go into the underground buildings. I pulled my hand back, deciding to leave it alone. But as I turned to walk away, a sharp metallic sound echoed from deep within the building. Clang! I spun around. The rusted steel door I had just looked at was wide open. Absolute blackness poured out from behind the threshold. Before I could process what was happening, a voice cut through the silence. Hello? I froze. The voice came from right inside the open doorway, sounding like a young woman. Hello? It sounded terrified, desperate. My instincts overrode my common sense, and I stepped closer to the opening. Is someone down there? I called out. A suffocating silence hung in the air. Then softly, please, down here. Without thinking, I aimed my flashlight downward and stepped toward the threshold. That was when I noticed a narrow set of concrete steps leading straight down into the pitch black. I should have run. Instead, I took my first step down into the freezing, dripping dark. At the bottom, a long, narrow corridor stretched out before me, old pipes dripping water with a maddening rhythm. I swept my light across the floor. Lying in the dirt was a rotting work boot and a rusted, ancient flashlight. I called out again. No answer. Then I cast my flashlight beam against the damp concrete walls. Someone had scratched dozens of names into the stone over the years. Some were old and faded. But right in the center, a section looked freshly carved. The letters were stark, white, and unmistakably new. My own name, Matthew. My blood ran cold. I reached out and touched the stone. The grooves were sharp and recently cut. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. But someone. 2, 3, running straight toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and bolted for the stairs, scrambling upward in blind terror as the footsteps pounded fiercely behind me. I slammed the heavy steel door shut, burst out of the building, and sprinted toward the shoreline. To my absolute horror, the dock was empty. Then I spotted Walter standing on the far side of the seawall, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Where were you? I screamed, gasping for air. Walter didn't answer my question. He just stared past me toward the dark silhouette of the communications building. Did you go downstairs? He whispered. I heard a woman, I stammered, shaking violently. She was asking for help. Walter closed his eyes in pure despair. You shouldn't have answered her. Without another word, he hauled me into the boat and cranked the engine to maximum speed, tearing away from the island as fast as it could go. As we pulled away, I looked back one last time at the tree line. A tall, formless figure stood motionless among the branches, watching us leave. When we finally reached the mainland, Walter told me the truth. Decades ago, several workers had vanished from that exact underground bunker. Officially, they went AWOL, but the locals knew better. People started hearing voices down there, Walter said quietly. Their own voices. And if you answered them, something answered back. The next day, I went straight to the Historical Society. The director looked at me like I was insane, insisting the lower level had been permanently sealed off in 1978. But when I showed him the photographs on my camera, he stopped scrolling on a picture of the open steel door. He pointed a shaking finger at the background wall. Right beside the door frame were 3 names carved deep into the concrete, the 3 workers who had vanished on the island 50 years ago. And directly beneath their names was mine. I thought I had escaped. I quit my job, deleted my research, and tried to live a normal life. But I still have that digital photograph saved on an encrypted drive. I've looked at it 100 times in the quiet dark of my apartment. And every time I zoom in, I notice something terrifying. The 3 names of the missing workers are there. My name is there. And beneath mine, another line has appeared. A fresh inscription carved into the concrete, written down a second time. Only this time, the letters are deeper, angrier, and carved with a violent force. As if whatever is waiting down in the dark is making damn sure I never forget it. When I was 21, I thought I was adventurous. Looking back now, I realize I was just reckless. I was finishing my last year of college, and most weekends I'd explore abandoned places around the coast with two friends of mine, Caleb and Nate. We weren't ghost hunters. We didn't go looking for the paranormal. We were simply fascinated by forgotten places. Old factories, abandoned houses, closed train stations, anything with a history. One Saturday in November, Caleb found an old nautical chart online. It showed a tiny island sitting several miles offshore. The island had once been used as a quarantine station for ships entering the harbor. The facility had closed decades ago. According to the information we found, nobody lived there anymore. There were only a few ruined structures left. Caleb immediately wanted to see it. The problem was, the island wasn't open to visitors. So naturally, we decided that meant we shouldn't go. Then we went anyway. We borrowed a small fishing boat from Nate's uncle and left just after sunrise. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, almost no wind. The sea was calm enough that the trip felt more like sightseeing than trespassing. About 40 minutes later, the island appeared. It was smaller than I'd expected. A rocky shoreline surrounded a thick patch of trees. Beyond the trees, I could see the remains of several buildings. The largest was a long white structure with a collapsed roof. We tied the boat to a metal ring embedded in the rocks. Before leaving, Nate checked his phone. No signal. Caleb laughed. Perfect. We climbed toward the buildings. The island was strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet. There were no birds. No insects. No sounds except our footsteps in the ocean behind us. We explored the main building first. The walls were covered in peeling paint. Old beds remained inside several rooms. Rusty medical equipment sat beneath layers of dust. One room still had a faded sign above the doorway. It read "Observation Ward." We photographed everything. Then Caleb found a stairway leading beneath the building. The lower level had partially flooded. We decided not to go down. Instead, we explored the upper floor. That's when I heard someone humming. It was faint, almost musical. I stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" Caleb and Nate looked at me. "Hear what?" I listened. The humming continued, a slow melody. It was coming from somewhere outside. I walked toward the nearest window. The sound stopped. I looked outside. Nothing. Then the humming started again, this time from another direction. Caleb laughed. "It's probably just the wind." "It doesn't sound like wind," I said. He shrugged. We moved on. About 20 minutes later, we reached the rear of the building. There was an old concrete courtyard surrounded by a high wall. In the center stood a dry stone fountain. Someone had placed fresh flowers inside it. They weren't dead. They weren't even wilted. They looked like they'd been picked that morning. Nate immediately became serious. "Okay." He looked at both of us. "Someone's been here." We searched the courtyard. Nothing. There were no footprints. No bags. No tools. Nothing. Just the flowers. We decided to leave. As we walked back toward the shoreline, I heard the humming again. This time, it was much louder. I turned around. At the far end of the courtyard stood a woman. She was wearing a long blue coat. Her back was facing us. She stood perfectly still. "Hey!" Caleb shouted. The woman didn't move. Nate grabbed my arm. "Don't." "What?" I asked. "Just leave." We started walking away. Then the woman spoke. "Please don't go." Her voice echoed strangely through the courtyard. Caleb stopped. I did too. The woman slowly turned around. I couldn't see her face clearly from that distance. She raised one hand, then pointed toward the building. "He's still inside." I felt my stomach drop. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked through a doorway. Caleb immediately started toward her. Nate grabbed him. "No, she needs help," Caleb argued. "We don't know who she is," Nate shot back. Caleb pulled his arm away. "I'm checking." He walked into the building. I followed. Nate reluctantly came with us. We searched the hallway. Nothing. "Hello?" No response. Caleb called out again. "Are you okay?" Then we heard footsteps above us. Someone was running across the second floor. Caleb looked at me. "Is that her?" Before I could answer, the footsteps stopped. Then came 3 knocks. From the ceiling. Knock. 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 We stood there listening. Caleb slowly walked toward the stairs. I told him not to. He ignored me. Halfway up, he stopped. What? He pointed toward the landing. There was a door. It hadn't been there before, or at least none of us remembered seeing it. It was painted bright blue, the same color as the woman's coat. Caleb reached for the handle. I grabbed his shoulder. Don't. He looked at me. Then something behind the door whispered, Caleb. His face changed instantly. The voice sounded exactly like his mother. He stepped backward. How does it know my name? Nobody answered. Then the voice came again. Caleb, open the door. This time it sounded like Nate. Nate went pale. That's not me. The voice changed again. It sounded like me. Please. I backed away from the staircase. We're leaving. Nobody argued. We ran. We didn't care about our equipment. We didn't care about the photographs. We sprinted toward the shoreline, but when we reached the rocks, the boat was gone. The rope had been cut. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Then Nate pointed toward the water. Our boat was drifting several hundred yards offshore. Someone had pushed it away. We were stranded. Caleb started swearing. I looked back toward the island. The buildings were silent. Then the humming began again, except this time it was coming from behind us. We turned. The woman in the blue coat was standing at the top of the hill. She was facing us. Her face was hidden beneath the shadow of the trees. She raised one arm and pointed toward the water. Our boat suddenly stopped drifting. It turned, slowly, and began moving back toward the island. Nobody was steering it. We watched in silence as the boat approached the shore. When it reached us, Nate climbed aboard first. The engine was off. The keys were still in the ignition. But there was something inside the boat that hadn't been there before. A wet coat, folded neatly across the driver's seat. None of us touched it. We simply started the engine and left. The entire ride home was silent. We never saw the woman again. A few weeks later, I tried researching the island. That's when I found something disturbing. The quarantine station had closed after an outbreak in the 1950s. Several patients had died there. One of the nurses was named Evelyn Mercer. According to the records, she disappeared during the final week the facility operated. Her body was never found. There was a photograph of her in one of the archived documents. She was wearing a blue coat. I stared at that photograph for a long time. It looked exactly like the woman we'd seen. But there was something else. The photograph had been taken in front of the same building we'd explored. And behind Evelyn stood 3 other people. 3 patients. All of them had died during the outbreak. I saved the photograph and closed my laptop. I haven't gone back. Neither have Caleb or Nate. But there is one detail that still bothers me: the flowers. When we returned to the mainland, Nate had taken a photograph of them before we left the island. We looked at it later. The flowers weren't inside the fountain. They were sitting beside a small memorial plaque. The plaque had a date engraved into it. It was from the year the quarantine station closed. And beneath the date were 4 names: Evelyn Mercer, and the 3 patients from the photograph. We thought that was the end of it, until Caleb noticed something in the corner of the picture. Someone had carved a 5th name into the stone. The letters were difficult to read, but they were unmistakable. It was Caleb's name. None of us had noticed it while we were standing there. And the worst part, the carving looked old, much older than our visit. I've never been able to explain what happened on that island. Maybe there was someone living there. Maybe someone was playing some elaborate game with us. Maybe there was a completely rational explanation for everything. But I still think about that woman sometimes, especially when I'm near the ocean, because I remember exactly what she said before we left. He's still inside. I always assumed she meant there was someone trapped in the building, but sometimes I wonder if she was talking about something else, something that never left the island.